G'day and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to talk to you about some of the hidden causes of adductor tendinopathy that I find clinically, and hopefully get you to do a couple of really simple exercises to improve the way that you're loading those adductor tendons to allow them to settle down a little bit faster. So the first thing that I really want to talk about in terms of adductor tendinopathy is that if you're dealing with some dysfunction high up in that groin where those groin muscles attach up into your pelvis, it's really important to understand that that is often a consequence of something else. Those tissues have become dysfunctional not because there's a failure of those tissues in isolation, but because they're not enjoying the environment that they're in, and that is setting up those tendons to become a problem and to stay dysfunctional long term. So if you're trying to develop a strategy to fix an adductor tendinopathy, it's really important you take a step back to consider what those dysfunctional areas might be, fix those areas, and then also work hard at improving the way that you're loading that tendon itself to get the fastest and best results possible. So the two areas of the body that I find tend to set up an adductor tendon to fail are dysfunction in the lower back and hip dysfunction, hip joint dysfunction. And what I tend to see is that there's often some hidden restrictions or some tissue that's stiffer or tighter than it needs to be that is asking those tissues, those adductor tissues, to become dysfunctional to compensate for that hidden restriction. So the first two things that I want to go through is I want to show you a very simple way to free up a lower back that I find generally relates to those adductor tendons. And I also want to go through a hip joint stretch, a hip joint capsular stretch that we've done a lot on the channel before, that will also help to improve the way that you're loading the hip joint and transfer that normal loading towards those adductor tendons, giving them the best chance to settle down faster and get you back to what you want to do as quickly as possible. So what we want to do in terms of the lower back is you can take something like a foam roller. You can definitely use a lacrosse ball or a tennis ball like we've done a lot on the channel before. But the area of the back that we're looking for is, we're not just looking for the lower section of the back, which is often the area that we tend to look at the most. We want to look a little bit higher at the junction of that rib cage where it meets the lower back, just in case we're not missing anything that could be related. And generally what I tend to find clinically is when we're talking about hip dysfunction or groin dysfunction, generally the higher sections of the lower back and the base of the rib cage is often quite stiff and quite restricted, not only through the muscles of the back, but the joints of the spine as well, where the nerves come from that supply the groin muscles and also the hip muscles. But that section we want to go hunting for you could be a little bit different depending on the person, but we want to make sure we're trying to uncover and remove as much of that restricted tissue as possible to allow those adductor tendons to function better and to settle down as quickly as possible. So again, a great way to do this is with a foam roller. So all I want you to do is just gently lie down on top of the roller. You can go all the way back if you feel comfortable, but all we're trying to do here is we're trying to move the roller up and down until we find a section of the back that feels a little bit tender. Most likely it's going to feel a bit stiff and restricted. That's what we're looking for. Move it up and down to find a spot that feels a little bit stiff. Then if you roll across to one side or roll across to the other side, take note of where you feel the most restricted and tender section of your spine might be. We're just going to put some constant tension through that part of your body. And for me, I feel a little bit tighter on the left-hand side, so I'm going to roll a little bit more at that left-hand side. Give it a good squeeze. Squeeze all the tissue in between the roller and your spine. Get it to tense up. And the idea is that when you relax, it should feel like it gives a little bit. It should feel a little less tender, a little less restricted than it did previously. And all I want you to do here is just move the roller up or down, depending on where you feel the most obvious part of your body is. It's a bit stiff. For me, this is a little bit tender here, which tells me that there's some dysfunction there that I wouldn't notice day to day because I don't have low back pain in this scenario. And then all I want you to do is spend enough time on each section for you to feel like it starts to give a little bit, becomes a little bit less tender, a little less uncomfortable, and I'm hopefully be pleasantly surprised that there may be a section of your back that once you take away some of that restriction, you might see an immediate improvement in your groin symptoms. Maybe not 100% straight away, because that groin tendon has to become dysfunctional in its own right to become painful and sore, but you'll hopefully feel like something positive has taken a step in the right direction straight away. So the next exercise we want to work through revolves around that hip joint or a stiff hip joint capsule. And one of the things I find clinically is if you do have some restriction in that hip joint, it changes the way that you load everything else around that hip joint. And in a lot of instances, the groin muscles, those adductor tendons, can become dysfunctional, or the way that you use those tendons can change over time if they're dealing with a closely associated hip joint stiffness or some capsular stiffness in the hip. Now again, if you've been a fan of the channel, you'll know one of the best exercises to free up a stiff hip joint is the hip joint capsular stretch. So what I'd like you to do is, again, take note of how your groin symptoms feel to begin with. We're going to do this stretch, and I'm going to ask you to do the same thing again and make sure you feel a genuine difference in terms of how mobile your hip feels, and then hopefully how much better your groin tissue may feel as a result. So what I'd like you to do, again, the classic position when we start on all fours, if we're doing this particular hip, we're going to take your other leg back so that you're able to place more pressure through this part of your body. And then what we want to get you to do is gently shifting your body weight across. We want to make sure that you feel like there's some tension or some pressure going through the back side of that hip. So imagine that your thigh bone is pressing at the back of your hip, and you're keeping your shoulders and your hips parallel to the ground, and you're shifting everything across until you feel a gentle pressure on the outside of that hip. Now, a lot of people tend to go too far, and they tend to shift their hips all the way across and create a bit of an awkward angle in terms of where the back goes. But if you keep everything integrated, you should find that you won't have to move too far until you feel some pressure through that hip. And then all I want you to do here is camp out in this position for about 30 seconds to a minute. Allow that tissue to give, allow your hip joint capsule to stretch a little bit, and want to come back into the middle again. Now, depending on where you feel comfortable being, you can drop as far back into hip flexion as you feel comfortable and come across. At no stage should you feel your groin pain at all. You shouldn't feel like your hip joint is jamming up at all. You shouldn't feel those adductor tendons feeling uncomfortable. All the pressure should be at the back side of that hip, and we can adjust your position accordingly. So if you are very much down into some hip flexion here and you come across and you feel that groin pain in an instant, then make sure that you come out of that stretch a little bit more and come across. There will be a position that you can find where it feels very comfortable through the groin, but mostly through the side / back of that hip. Because the other two things we want to do here is not only do we want to work on trying to improve the hip flexion aspect of this pending how it feels for you, but we also want to work on the rotational components as well to target where you feel your specific hip capsular tightness may be the most. So the second aspect here is you want to rotate your leading leg underneath to externally rotate the hip. You can drop your back leg to block that position, and then we're going to come back into the exact same positions again, looking to try and find an angle that generates some really comfortable tightness, potentially more towards the back of the hip joint this time. And again, you can oscillate in and out of that position if you want to, but it's also very helpful just to spend some time in this position, allow the tissues to accommodate. Again, we're not necessarily stretching muscle tissue here. This is more of a fibrous tissue, so you might need to spend some time here to get it to give a little bit. And then again, once you've done that, come back out of that position again. And then this time when we're targeting internal rotation, all we want to do with your foot is we want to turn your foot outwards or towards the camera in this instance before you drop down and then come across in the same position as the previous two. And again, this one may be more sort of groin specific. If it is, then again, don't be as deep into that hip flexion as well. Come out of it a little bit more so. Just go looking for some tightness, this time a little bit further around the front of the hip. Nothing in the groin again. Nothing should hurt you while you're doing this. We're going to spend about 30 seconds to 60 seconds in this position once you've found something that feels very comfortable to you. And then again, once you've done those three positions, what you should feel immediately is that hip joint feels looser straight away. The purpose of that stretch is to make sure that there's an immediate amount of slack that goes into the joint. So if you're doing something like a squat or hopping or jumping, it should feel looser immediately to some degree. And if that is playing an immediate role in your symptoms, ideally you'll also feel an instant change in how much tension there is in your groin, or maybe how sore that groin tissue feels. By freeing up the lower back, by freeing up the hip, we're trying to take out two of the main players, two of the main components for why there's been a change in the way that you've been loading your adductor tendons over time and what might be setting them up to become dysfunctional in the way that they are. Now remember, again, the adductor tendons have to change and morph at a cellular level to become a tendinopathy or to become dysfunctional. So just changing your back function and your hip function is very unlikely to cure your symptoms in an instant. But we're looking at improving the way that you're loading those tissues so that your symptoms can settle down a lot faster and feel better, maybe beyond what they would if you didn't look after those particular areas. So the third thing that I think is really important to do if you are suffering from an adductor tendinopathy is we need to make sure that you're working hard on some gluteal strength. Obviously, we're trying to free up that hip joint by doing the capsular stretch, but the other thing that we need to do is we need to add some strength to the tissue around your groin muscles in order to, again, normalize the way that you're loading those tissues. And a great way to do this is we can get you to grab a band, like a booty band, a band that goes around your knees. And we can do a number of different exercises to strengthen your glutes and your hip muscles. So some of those can be lying on your side doing a clam, or lying on your side doing the side-lying hip abductions. There's fire hydrants, there's monster walks, there's a whole bunch of different things that you can do. But I find, quite simply, one of the best and most functional exercises that you can do here is some gentle squatting exercises. So for me, this is obviously a very functional exercise. It's very easy to manage the amount of load that you're putting through your tissue. It's very easy to also protect your groin as well if you find that going too deep makes it feel sore, or doing too many makes it feel sore. But the technique that I think is really important to work on here is, ideally we want you to be able to squat with your feet straight. But the technique that I think gets lost or overlooked a lot is we also want to make sure that you're screwing your knees out to basically improve the position of your arches, but also by turning your knees out, we're engaging a lot of your hip rotational muscles, a lot of the muscles that help support and stabilize your hip, very much like the rotator cuff does for the shoulder. But by having the band on there at the same time, we'll almost force you to do that on its own without thinking about it too much. But then what we want to get you to do, as you're squatting down, we want to make sure that you keep that tension on the band. And if you've got your knees screwed out, you'll see that your knees go a lot further apart than they would normally. So if you're someone who squats with your knees over your toes, you've actually got a lot more range of motion that you can access to create a more stable hip joint and a more stable ankle joint by going to the extremes of your external rotated position. And then by doing enough of these, say 10 or 15 of these, you should hopefully feel that the muscles in your hips begin to fatigue quite a lot. But then the next day, after having a good session of doing this, you should hopefully feel some of that next day muscle soreness, that delayed onset of muscle soreness, or DOMS, that really helps you feel confident that you're doing the right thing. But as I was saying, you can do any glute strength exercises that you find are comfortable and helpful. If you like some variety, as I said, do some clams, do some fire hydrants, do some crab walks, whatever you feel hits the spot for you. But some gluteal strength is highly important for adductor tendinopathy because, again, we need to support the entire complex, not just the tissue itself. So obviously hunt around for something specific that you feel works for you and your symptoms. Obviously speak to your physio or PT to make sure that you've got something that really respects your issue that you're dealing with. But then the last thing that I think is really important to do is that we've worked basically around the groin tissue without actually doing anything to that area. So obviously by freeing up your back, freeing up your hip, and improving the strength of the muscles of your hip, we're trying to improve the environment that those adductor tendons are functioning within, trying to take away some of the hidden causes for why that adductor muscle has become sore, why those adductor tendons have become dysfunctional. Because if you just focus on your adductor tendons, it's unlikely that you're going to fix this long term. There has to be a reason why that specific part of your body has become sore. So working on the things around it that could contribute to it logically tend to set you up for success rather than long-term failure. But having said that, we still want to give you something to hopefully improve your immediate symptoms that you're dealing with, to hopefully help you do what you need to do day to day. And one of the great exercises I found for this is we can take a ball or a roller in this instance. We can go hunting through your adductor muscles, your groin muscles, for any areas that feel tight, restricted, and tender. Fit as much slack up into the tendons as they attach into your pelvis to try and normalize the way that those adductor tendons are being loaded up day to day. So a great way to do this is, if you can lie down on your tummy again and basically have the foam roller basically into that groin area. So again, if you go too high, it will feel sore and uncomfortable. Use common sense as to where you feel you need to be here. But all I want you to do is, once you've found a spot that feels a little bit tight and a little bit tender, more sort of into the top third of that sort of inner groin area of your thigh. So all I need you to do here is you can just tense up on top of that. So we're not trying to roll around on the tissue. You can definitely move the roller around till you find something that feels tender and tight. And then I want to get you to basically squeeze your glutes underneath that. So push your hip back into the roller, tense those tissues up for about 5 seconds. Again, what this does is it gets your brain active, it gets your brain involved, and then when you stop tensing it up, there's this reflexive response that happens where when you let go, your brain also feels more comfortable, more safe letting go, and it releases some of that tissue a little bit more than what it would have been otherwise. And then it should feel a little bit less tender. And then again, just hunt around for the next spot that feels the most tight and restricted to you. Because your adductor muscles, those groin muscles, anchor right down into the knee, if you straighten your knee, You may also find a slightly different stimulus, or it might grant you access into a version of your restricted tissue that you may not have been able to find with the knee bent. It generally puts this tissue under a little bit more tension. And again, your job is just to hunt around for things that feel tight and restricted. Spend some time letting the roller press into that, squeeze that tissue, make the tissue work for about 5 seconds. When you relax, the tissue will give a little bit. You should feel a little bit nicer straight away. And again, as you're working your way through here, another thing that you can do is that once you've found something that feels tight, we can incorporate movements of other areas into this to improve the results that we're getting. So again, once you've found something that feels tight, you can gently bend and flex your knee to try and shear that tissue free. You can also try and roll your hip up and down, again, to try and pancake some tissue down there and shear that tissue free and allow that tissue to give in ways that you might find if you were just leaving the roller here or actually physically rolling up and down. But this is a really great way to find a lot of the more symptomatic things that you might be dealing with and then try and take some of that away, feed more slack into those adductor tendons, those groin tendons, again, in an attempt to try and normalize your symptoms faster than it would if you just didn't do this kind of stuff. So obviously getting a massage through those tissues will also help. But a foam roller is a great way to try and make that happen for yourself. So with that being said, I genuinely hope the ideas and the exercises in this video help give you a little bit more perspective as to why your adductors became sore in the first place, and also what you might need to work on to get through this quicker, but also to make sure that the long-term health of this area improves and, more importantly, normalizes back to where it should be. So if you found that was helpful, please consider leaving a like rating down below. Subscribe to the channel if you're new, please. If you found that this really helped you sort of overcome some issues that you didn't realize that you were dealing with, then please consider leaving a super thanks donation on the video. It's just a great way to help support me and the channel. But with that being said, I genuinely hope that was helpful for you. If it was, let me know, but we'll see you in the next one.